Welcome to this edition of Trash Compactor, and in this episode I will be making a custom Moff Gideon. Moff Gideon is a character that appears in Season 1 of The Mandalorian, with his ominous entrance in his awesome TIE fighter. For this build I'm going to be using this chap My Soldier. This figure I found in a charity shop for £1. I have had a look and he is also available on eBay. When I saw him in the charity shop, I couldn't believe how much he looked actually like the actor in The Mandalorian, minus the moustache of course. So I'm going to be using the head of this figure and putting it onto the body of a AT-AT commander. The armour is very similar structure. This figure is a bit of a beater, he's got loose limbs, a bit of paint rub, and then also using a plastic cape which I had on a Kylo Ren modern figure. And I think trimming this cape down will just give the right look for the Moff Gideon character. It's got the boots, it's got the armour, it's got the shape. A little bit of dremeling to do. First things first, pop and boil the AT-AT commander. Don't need to pop and boil the chap My Soldier because it's held together with screws. So I've taken the screws out, and as you can see he just comes apart really easily and the head comes out. It has rather a long neck with a little bit of a peg at the bottom to hold it in place. I don't need the body. I will put that into my spares pile and use that somewhere else. So my commander's had a bit of time to soften. He's nice and flexible, and I just need to pop his head off with a tea towel because it's quite hot. Comes off really easily. The head has this very long neck, and what I'm going to need to do is to cut that down to be able to fit it onto the body. So I'm going to have to take quite a bit off, because if I literally just cut the peg off he's going to look like a giraffe. I'm going to chop the neck down right just under his chin. The neck is quite thick, so I'm going to have to trim around the outside of the neck to make it fit the commander's body. Constantly going back and measuring just to make sure that I don't make it too small. One of my top tips for when you're trimming plastic is when you do scar any coloured plastic, it does leave almost like a white mark where the scalpel blade cuts through the plastic. I find that using the plastic weld, or any equivalent plastic weld that's good for bonding, if you use that paint onto the plastic, it actually removes the white marks that you get on the plastic. I want to get the head onto the body, and what I'm going to have to do is use my Dremel to drill a hole into the head. So to make sure that I get this in the right place, I'm just going to use the blade of my Stanley knife just to make a mark on the plastic so I'm directly in the middle. And then using the drill tool on my Dremel, I'm just gently going to drill into the head. Now I don't know if it's hollow, it could be solid, so I've got to be careful. If it's hollow it can tend to pull the drill through really quickly and you can end up going straight through the top of the head. So I think the hole's roughly around the right size. There is a little bit of feathering from the plastic, but just trim this off with your knife blade. And you can see, because the plastic's quite soft, it does fit on there quite nicely. You'll notice the front of his neck hangs over the front a little bit. Yep, I'm going to have to trim that down. So using my knife, just going to cut into the chin and underneath. And then again, once I've done that, to remove the white marks, I'm just going to use my plastic weld and paint it onto the surface of the figure. I think what this does is it slightly melts the plastic, but it doesn't distort it too much. So it gives it a smoother appearance once you've done any cutting on any plastic. And there you go, that head fits on quite nicely and he's already starting to look quite effective. So the next thing I'm going to do is sort out the cape. The cape's going to require quite a bit of trimming. It's quite a full cape, quite Darth Vader-y. And Moff Gideon's cape isn't so full round the front, it tends to hang off the back of his shoulders, and also this cape is a little bit too long for the figure. The Kylo Ren figure is quite tall and is a bit of a hunchback. Just using my trimming tools, I'm just going to trim a bit off, and as I go through I'm going to trim more and more off just to make it a little bit shorter. I always think it's best to take too little off and then you can take more off, because if you take too much off you can't add it back on. So that's starting to look right. Still not the final shape because I want to trim off some on each side from the front. So I did start doing that and actually pressed stop on my video and missed me cutting it off, but it's not the end of the world. So as you can see, I've started to trim it off, and this is probably the first stage, and I'll probably do about another 2 or 3 trims of the cape as we go through. So it's starting to open up a bit more and look a bit more like the character in the Mandalorian. So again, trimming a little bit more off and actually starting to shape the neck. The character does have almost like these armour pads on his shoulders, and I can't really apply these to the figure, so I'm going to apply these to the cape. So this cape is quite square across the shoulders. So using my knife, I've just trimmed that so it sort of looks like it's hanging from what will become the pieces of armour. Again, trimming a bit off the bottom because I did feel it was a bit too long. And now what I need to do is to cut again into the cape to sort of do a curve around the shoulders and then going down the body. And again, taking a little bit off at a time, because if you take too much off you can't put it back. So there is almost the shape of the armour at the top of his arm, so I will paint them later on with a gloss black. But the cape is very, very shiny and is going to be very difficult to paint, so I'm giving it a sand down with some fine sandpaper just to rough it up a bit. And then where it's sort of feathered a bit and there's a bit of particles, I'm just using my plastic weld to paint over the cape, just to smooth it, give it more of a better texture. Plastic weld dries and evaporates quite quickly when it's not been in contact with other plastic, so it's a great little tip for smoothing down feathered plastic. Now, one thing I did realise as I was doing this, his hands are really small, and if you look at Moff Gideon, he's actually got a pair of decent sized gloves. So I've got this Hoth Han lying around. I think I got him in a bundle that I bought off eBay where he's missing his head and one of his legs, so he sort of got utilised in other areas. So I've got the gloves, so I've chopped the gloves off, and what I'm going to do is just work out where they need to be on the body of Moff Gideon, and I'm going to put these gloves on, making sure I position them, because ultimately we want him to be able to hold the dark saber. So using a bit of super glue, I'm just putting the gloves on, making sure that they go into the centre of the arm, so they've got a nice ridge around them, so they look like proper gloves. And then with the cape, you can see it's starting to come together. The main thing I need to do is his body armour isn't right, because Moff Gideon seems to have a bit of curve, like a curved armour plate. So just using a Sharpie, I'm just going to roughly draw onto the figure where I want to Dremel, bearing in mind the body of the figure is hollow, so I can't go too deep, or I may actually just go straight through the body and create a bit of a hole. But if I do, it'll be fine, because I can just fill it with a little bit of super glue, a little bit of filler. It's going to get painted anyway. So just using my knife, what I'm going to do is, before I start cutting away at the armour, the little plate that is on the attack commander's body, I'm going to cut that off because I want to apply that later on to the front of the Moff Gideon armour. So I've taken that off with my knife and just trimming around the edges of the plastic to smooth it off. It's not completely flat, but it doesn't really matter, it'll look quite good when it's on the chest plate. If you don't have a Dremel, you could spend some time trimming away the plastic. What I tend to do is I started to smooth that off and sand it down to sort of create a flatter surface, and then with my Stanley knife on the line I cut into the plastic so I've got an area to Dremel up to, and then I sort of get a bit of a sharper edge. You could just do it straight with a Dremel if your Dremeling skills were up to scratch, but I'm not the best person with a Dremel. It's not even a Dremel. So there we go, using a flat tool I'm gently grinding away the plastic and smoothing it down, taking a little bit off because I don't want to go too far, I could end up going straight into his body. There is a lot of feathering from the plastic, so using a flat tool again, just going over the feathered areas to take that off and smooth it down. You may also notice there is a very, very tiny little hole as well on the right hand side of the figure. I'll fill that later with a bit of super glue, and then give that a good sand down so it's nice and smooth. I tend to use a really fine sandpaper when I'm doing my figures. Also, a little bit of plastic weld over the plastic to help smooth it all down, make it a little bit more flush. Works a treat, just don't stick any of the plastic on it while it's drying. So that's had a bit of time to dry off, a bit smoother than it was. For Moff Gideon's belt, I'm going to use a cable tie. I've used cable ties before in previous builds for detail. He's got quite a thick belt with a red trim and a silver buckled front. So just cutting the cable tie, gently putting that around the figure, working out how far it needs to go, sticking a bit of super glue on there, bit of glue, and then another cable tie over the top of that cable tie and pulling it tight to keep it in place while it dries. So now I'm going to have a go at getting my dark saber ready. So using a couple of cable ties, I'm going to put these sort of the grooved serrated edge, stick them together. It's a little thick, but it just gives it a bit of stability and it won't look floppy. And then I'm popping a jam jar on it just to keep it down, and then leave that off for a while to dry. So on the front of his chest panel, I want to create a little bit of a raised area on the front of his armour. So I'm using this plastic lid that I've got off a yoghurt pot. Just cutting a rough square out, and then just going to put that against the figure and work out roughly where the curve needs to be. And the idea is that's sort of going to sit on the front. So just trim that, make the curved top, trim it off a little bit by bit, giving it a good sand. Then that will go on the front of the figure with a little bit of super glue. Creates the raised panel. And then a little bit of plastic weld just to paint around the outside, just to help bond the two together and smooth out the rough edges on the panel. I'm also sticking a bit of plastic weld around the belt. And then I'm going to leave that to dry off for several hours. So he's had some time to dry off, so what I'm going to do is just cut that little bit of a supporting cable tie off the figure. My dark saber should have dried. Probably could have had the edges a little bit more flush if I'm brutally honest, but it's fine. I will trim it down. I used a vintage lightsaber as a bit of a reference for size. Could have used a modern one, but the modern ones are about 8 foot long, so I just thought I'd go with a vintage. And then I was trying to figure out how he's going to hold, how thick the piece of plastic needs to be for the handle of the dark saber. I could just use a full strip, but I decided, stupidly enough, this was so fiddly, it took me so long to actually make a dark saber hilt. So I used a bit of super glue and plastic weld, made sure I got it nice and straight, left that to dry. And then for the front of his belt, I actually took an old peg, neck piece from another figure, cut a very fine disc, and then used this and stuck this on the front of the belt. And then applying the cut off belt readout onto the chest plate, and then using some very small discs of plastic, stuck those on the panel just to create a little bit of detail when I paint on his chest lights. So I've left them to dry. One thing I didn't realise is I left his emblem on from the commander, and Moff Gideon doesn't have an emblem or any rank on his armour. So just gently cut that off with my Stanley knife, filled it in with a little bit of super glue, and then sanded it down with a little bit of sandpaper. And once that's painted, it'll just completely disappear. So using my sandpaper, I've just gone round, tidied up some of the areas where some of the plastic melt and the glue was, and then using a nice stiff brush, just brushed all the dust off. Then I give my dark saber a bit of a sand, being careful not to snap it off because this is a display piece, it's not for playing with. It won't be the plastic glued together isn't the strongest thing in the world, so the last thing I want to do is snap the handle. So I'm going to use a Humbrol matte paint. He's going to get a completely full covering of the matte. So quite generous with this, getting into all the nooks and crannies, giving him a good coverage. And then to help spread the paint out and emphasise some of the detail, I'm going to use a dry brush just to push the paint around the figure and make sure that it has a nice smooth even coverage. So I'll leave that to dry off and then I'll focus back on the cape. So for the cape, I want the inside of the cape to be a dark red. As you can see, I started mixing this and went too dark, so I started to add a little bit more red and a bit more red. Started to paint that inside, and that sort of works for the first layer. The coverage isn't perfect, but after that's dried, that then gives me a bit of a base to then start to add some more red. So I thought, right, let's see what it's like if I go completely red. And then realised that's way too bright. Looks like something from the last Skywalker movie. And it's quite patchy. So once that dried off, I used that red, applied some of the previous dark mix that I had before, and that sort of gave me the right colour. And then painting that onto the cape, you can see it gives a better tone and it's a more solid colour. So I'm going to leave that to dry. My figure's joints are all still moving, giving it another dust off with a stiff brush to get rid of any particles of dust. And now the next thing to do is to start to paint the gloss areas of the body. So this is his armour, his gloves and his boots. So that's had some time to dry off and looking quite effective. So he's got a nice shine to his armour, to his boots and his gloves, and works quite nicely. The matte has a little bit of a sheen to it, but it's not too shiny. Mixing a bit of red with the previous paint that I mixed, I'm just going to gently paint on the red strips around his belt. This is very fiddly, but the cable tie does have a raised edge, so it works quite well. Also painting the detail on his shoulders, and then using a little bit of white to paint the lights on his chest dashboard. And then one of my favourite things is one of those silver pens to mark the belt buckle. So I'll leave the body to dry for a little while now, and what I want to do is on the cape that I previously sanded, I'm just going to apply the armour pads to the front in gloss so they stand out, and then leave those to dry. So for the head, there isn't much I need to do with the head apart from add the moustache. So using one of my Super 0.5 permanent pens, which works a treat on figures, I'm just going to go off screen a minute and use my magnifying glasses, because the distance I have to be to do my builds I can't really see, because my arms are fully extent because I've got a camera and lights between me and the actual figure while I'm recording my videos. So using my magnifying glasses I'm able to then get a close-up on the head and paint the tash on. So looking back to the dark saber now, that's had a good time to dry, and then using the silver marker pen I'm going to go over and paint the hilt. And then using some black gloss just to generously paint over the dark saber so it's got a bit of shine. Then leave that to dry. So that's dried off now, it's got a nice sheen to it. And if I pop the head on, cape, give him his dark saber, as you can see that's come together quite nicely, and I've got my custom Moff Gideon. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, please subscribe. If you have any suggestions for any future builds, please drop them in the comments.
What a piece of junk!